July 27, 1944. A small village called St. Gilles, a few miles west of St. Lo, Normandy. Major Helmut Ritgen, Panzer Regiment commander in the elite Panzer Lehr Division, was trying to do something that should have been simple. He was trying to move tanks down a road. He could not do it. In his post-war memoir, The Western Front, 1944, Memoirs of a Panzer Lehr Officer, Ritgen described that day in plain words. Every road to his panzers, he wrote, was monitored by what he called the murderous, circling thunderbolts. He used the phrase Russian roulette to describe the only tactic available to a German tank crew that needed to move. You waited for an American fighter bomber to dive, fire, climb back up, and reset. In the seconds between the climb and the next dive, you ran 100 meters. Then you dove for cover because another thunderbolt was already overhead. Ritgen's description was simple. It took an eternity to move along any road. Now here is what made this experience completely incomprehensible to Ritgen and to every German tank officer in Normandy. Air support in the German army was a slow weapon. You requested it through proper channels. The request went up to Corps, from Corps to a Luftwaffe liaison officer, from the liaison officer to a Luftflotte. Hours passed. By the time the planes arrived, if they arrived at all, the moment had usually passed with them. Air support was something you scheduled, not something you summoned, but the Americans were summoning it, and the time between the summons and the strike was not measured in hours. It was measured in minutes. A German column would identify a threat. A radio call would go out. Within minutes, sometimes within 4 or 5 minutes, a flight of P-47 Thunderbolts would drop out of the clouds and tear the column apart. The tanks would back into the woods. The planes were already orbiting the woods. The tanks would try a parallel road. The planes were already on that road. It was as if the infantry the Germans were fighting and the Air Force harassing them were not separate enemies, but the same enemy. In a captured German report examined after the war, a senior Wehrmacht commander listed the factors crippling German operations in Normandy. He described the immensely powerful, at times overwhelming, superiority of the enemy in the air. During the day, he wrote, practically the entire German movement on roads, on tracks, and open country was pinned down. The phrase he chose was almost completely paralyzed. To understand why German tankers were baffled by American infantry calling in airstrikes in minutes, we have to go back, not to D-Day, to 1943, where one American general looked at how his air support was failing his soldiers and decided to break every rule the textbooks had ever written about how it should work. His name was Elwood Quesada. They called him Pete, and what he was about to build would, in the words of one Panzer Lehr commander, leave entire German divisions, in his exact words, finally annihilated before the American infantry had even closed with them. This is the forensic story of how American infantrymen learned to call in fighter bombers in less time than it takes to brew a pot of coffee, and how that single capability, more than tanks, more than artillery, more than numbers, broke the back of the German army in the West. Part 1. To understand the breakthrough, you have to understand the problem. And the problem was not technological. The problem was institutional, cultural, and old. In every major army at the start of the Second World War, the Air Force and the Army were two different worlds. They reported up different chains of command. They sometimes spoke on incompatible radios. The pilots considered themselves a professional elite. The infantrymen considered the pilots distant, glamorous, and largely useless when there was actual fighting on the ground. The German Luftwaffe was, on paper, supposed to be different. From its formation in the 1930s, German air doctrine emphasized that the Luftwaffe was the tactical force whose primary mission was to support the army. The Stuka became the symbol of that doctrine. In Poland in 1939, in France in 1940, the world watched German tanks and German planes work together with a coordination that looked supernatural. People called it blitzkrieg. But here's the thing about German air-ground coordination that nobody outside Germany understood until later. Even blitzkrieg, even at its peak, depended on pre-planned strikes against pre-identified targets. The plan was made the night before. The pilots flew the routes they were told to fly. They hit the targets they were assigned. When something unexpected happened, when an unknown anti-tank gun appeared, The German tank commander could not just pick up a radio and call down a Stuka. He had to send a request back through Corps. The Luftwaffe liaison officer at Corps had to forward it. The Luftflotte had to task a unit. A typical response time was measured in hours. The American Army Air Forces in the late 1930s had, if anything, a worse problem. The Air Corps was obsessed with strategic bombing factories, bombing cities. The pre-war manuals barely mentioned ground support. When training exercises were held with Army units, the Air Corps tended to skip them. Then came February 1943. A pass in Tunisia called Kasserine. The American Army, fighting its first major engagement against German veterans, was scattered, encircled, and shattered. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's units punched through American positions with terrifying ease. Among the lessons painfully learned at Kasserine was this one: American air support, when it appeared at all, was usually too late, in the wrong place, and as likely to bomb its own troops as the enemy. There was no system. There were just pilots flying their own missions while infantry fought theirs. In the aftermath, an officer named Elwood Richard Quesada was watching from England. He had been part of the famous question mark flight in 1929, the demonstration of air-to-air refueling alongside Ira Eaker and Carl Spaatz. He was an aviation man through and through, but he was also, by temperament, an outsider. His own pilots later nicknamed him Terrible-Tempered Mr. Big. By the fall of 1943, Quesada had taken over 9th Fighter Command, soon to become 9th Tactical Air Command. He'd been given enormous latitude to do whatever he wanted with the fighter bombers, and he had a stubborn idea that ran against everything he had been taught. He believed his Air Force existed to help the soldier on the ground, not to win some independent strategic victory, not to chalk up dogfighting kills, to help the man with the rifle who was being shot at right now. This is where the title of our story starts to make sense. Because Quesada's idea was not just an attitude, it was a problem in mathematics. If a German air request needed to climb the chain to Corps, then to Luftflotte, then back down to a wing, the response time was hours. If an American infantryman could talk directly to a pilot orbiting overhead, the response time could be the time it took to push a button. The difference between hours and minutes was not a small improvement. It was a different kind of war. What Quesada built in the months before D-Day was almost embarrassingly simple. It was an idea so obvious that nobody in any other major army had bothered to implement it. He took the VHF radios from his fighter bombers, the SCR-522 sets, and he installed them in Sherman tanks at the front of armored columns. He removed the bow gunner from those Shermans. In the gunner's seat, where a soldier with a machine gun used to sit, he placed a fighter bomber pilot, a man who knew exactly what those pilots overhead could see, what they could hit, and what they could not. Then he did something even more radical. He had Bradley, his counterpart on the ground, agree to a deal. According to Quesada's biographer Thomas Hughes, Quesada told Bradley directly that this arrangement would, in his words, put the direction from the ground in language the fighter boy in the air could understand. Quesada would keep 4 P-47 Thunderbolts orbiting over the lead tank from dawn until dusk. Continuous cover. The pilot in the lead tank would talk to the pilots overhead in their own language, on the same radio frequency, in real time. When a German anti-tank gun opened up, the controller in the tank would not radio corps. He would not request anything. He would say there was an 88 in the tree line at 2 o'clock, and the planes orbiting 2,000 feet above him would already be dropping into their dive before he finished the sentence. The TACP Foundation, in its history of the system, called this a true example of U.S. forces imposing their will on the Germans, forcing them to make either a bad decision or a worse decision. The bad decision was to retreat under air attack. The worst decision was to stand and fight against an armored division, supported by what these historians called endless close air support. Endless. That was the word that mattered. The Germans had seen airstrikes before. They had seen carpet bombing. What they had never seen was a system in which the air did not leave. From dawn to dusk, every day, the planes were there. And the moment something on the ground moved, those planes knew about it. But here is the puzzle the German tankers could not solve. Even when they accepted that the planes were there constantly, they could not figure out how the American infantry, ordinary American soldiers, were directing those planes onto specific targets in real time. There were no radio operators in the front lines that the Germans could see. There were no Air Force officers visibly attached to American rifle companies. As far as a captured German prisoner could tell, the American GIs were ordinary infantry. And yet, they were summoning the Air Force at will. The answer to that puzzle was not just radios and tanks. It was a complete reinvention of how the Army and the Air Force talked to each other. And the next innovation took place in Italy in the spring of 1944, with a borrowed plane, a volunteer pilot, and a piece of code called Horsefly. Part 2. In Italy, in the late spring of 1944, an L-5 Sentinel pilot did something that would echo across the rest of the war. According to the standard reference works on forward air control, an anonymous L-5 pilot landed his small observation plane next to a tactical air controller and asked a simple question. Why were these little planes not being used to direct fighter-bomber attacks? They were small. They were quiet. They flew slowly enough to circle a target. They had a panoramic view from the air that no ground observer could match. Why were they only being used for artillery spotting? A second account credits Colonel Earl Reichert with making the same suggestion. Both may be true. The point is that on June 28, 1944, the first Horsefly forward air control mission took off in Italy. The planes were L-5 Sentinels, small two-seat observation aircraft, painted in different colors so the fighter bombers could tell them apart. Yellow Horsefly, blue Horsefly. The radios were SCR 522 VHF sets. The pilots were volunteer fighter bomber pilots who knew the language and the capabilities of the planes they would be controlling. Now, here is what Horsefly did that everything before it could not. A ground observer with binoculars in a foxhole could only see a few hundred yards in front of him. His view was blocked by trees, hedgerows, buildings, smoke. He could call in artillery on what he could see. He could not call in artillery on what was over the next ridge. The Horsefly pilot, 3,000 feet above the line, could see 20 miles. He could see the entire German rear area. He could see the Panzer Division forming up for a counterattack 10 kilometers behind the front line. When the first Horsefly missions ran in Italy, the results were so good that the system spread instantly. By the breakout from Normandy, Horsefly missions were operating across the American front. By 1945, Horsefly L5s were over the Siegfried Line. The American 6th Corps later reported that Horsefly was responsible for much of the effective bombing of Siegfried Line positions. Here is the detail that captures how robust the system was. According to the standard histories, total Horsefly losses for the entire war amounted to 1 L5 that wiped out its landing gear in a landing accident. 1. Not one shot down, not one lost to flak. 1 landing accident. These tiny, slow, unarmed planes flew over the front lines for nearly a year without losing a single aircraft to enemy action. Why didn't the Germans shoot them down? Because by the summer of 1944, the Luftwaffe was a shell of itself. American P-51 Mustangs and P-47s had killed the experienced German fighter pilots over Germany during the strategic bombing campaign. The pilots that were left were green replacements. And every time German fighters did try to engage the Horseflies, the cab rank of P-47s overhead descended on them. The Horsefly was protected by the same system it was helping to direct. So picture now what this looked like from the German side in July 1944. You are a panzer commander. You have moved your tanks under cover of darkness to a hidden assembly area. You think you are concealed. The trees are over your tanks. The camouflage netting is in place. Your engines are off. You're waiting for orders. You have no idea that a tiny aircraft with a single propeller is flying lazy circles 10 kilometers behind the American front line, 2,000 feet up, with its pilot looking down at your concealed assembly area through binoculars. You have no idea that the pilot's voice is going out in real time on a VHF radio frequency that 20 P-47s can hear simultaneously. You have no idea that those 20 P-47s are at this moment vectoring toward your hidden position with a precise grid reference and a description from a fellow aviator. The first thing you know in your concealed assembly area is the sound of the engines screaming overhead. By the time you hear them, the bombs are already falling. This is the puzzle piece that German prisoners in their interrogations could not figure out. They knew the planes were arriving fast. They knew the planes were finding them in places that should have been concealed. They could not figure out who was doing the seeing. The American infantry could not have seen them from inside the assembly area. The American forward observers were too far back. There seemed to be eyes on them that did not exist. There were eyes. The eyes were just 3,000 feet up in a tiny plane that the Germans had stopped paying attention to. Men like Bayerlin, men like Ritgen, men who had survived the Eastern Front and Africa and France. They had no category for what was happening to them. The system Quesada and his successors had built was so far ahead of German doctrine that the Germans, in their own words, simply could not understand it. The operations officer of a 17th SS Flak unit, writing in his diary as the breakout from Normandy unfolded, captured it in plain language. Wild confusion in all units, roads clogged with vehicles, heavy losses caused by Jabo attacks, since we have to move by daylight to escape encirclement. He went on to describe what he called a blood-curdling picture: blazing vehicles, exploding ammunition, burning fuel and supply trucks. Everyone, he wrote, was streaming to the rear. The American air-ground system was not just hitting tanks, it was breaking armies. The German soldier saw that there was nowhere to hide, nowhere to move, nowhere to assemble. So he did what soldiers throughout history have done when they decide there is no point continuing. He left. If your father, your grandfather, or your uncle served with the 26th Infantry, the 1st Division, the 30th Old Hickory Division, or in any unit of the 9th Air Force during the European campaign, the men you knew were part of this system. Hit the like button if you want their story to keep finding the people who care about getting it right. They built this together. They deserve to be remembered together. Part 3. By July 25th, 1944, the American First Army had been bogged down in the Normandy hedgerows for nearly 7 weeks. Casualties were horrific. The bocage was a green hell of small fields surrounded by walls of earth and roots that German anti-tank gunners and machine gunners turned into a defensive nightmare. American officers were beginning to talk about the possibility of stalemate, a World War I-style attritional grind that could last months or years. General Omar Bradley made a decision. He would use the heavy bombers to blow a hole in the German line. American B-17S and B-24S, normally tasked with destroying German factories, would be used as massive flying artillery. The target would be a narrow strip of front, about 3 miles wide, held by one of Germany's most elite remaining armored divisions, the Panzer Lehr Division, commanded by Lieutenant General Fritz Bayerlin. The operation was called Cobra, and it became the first proving ground at full scale of what the Quesada system could do. What happened to Panzer Lehr on July 25th has been described many times. Bayerlin's own post-war accounts, given in interrogations and later published in his memoirs, are the primary source. He described what came over his front line as a conveyor belt. By midday, in his exact words, the entire area resembled a Mondlandschaft, a moon landscape, bomb craters touching rim to rim, all signal communications cut. No command was possible. He described what he called the indescribable shock effect on his troops. Several of his men, he said, went mad and rushed around in the open until they were cut down by splinters. By his own count, over 70% of his soldiers were either dead, wounded, crazed, or dazed. The heavy bomber strike was not, strictly speaking, the Quesada system. The B-17S were not orbiting on call. They were a one-time blow delivered by 8th Air Force. But what happened next was where the real revolution showed itself. On July 26th, the American armored divisions began their breakout, and the moment they started moving, Quesada's armored column cover system kicked in with everything it had. According to the Combat Command A liaison officer of the 2nd Armored Division, whose report has survived in the records, the column cover consisted of 4 P-47 Thunderbolts continuously orbiting overhead, relieved by another flight every 30 minutes. The planes worked, in his words, quite close to us, generally with excellent results. The best air reconnaissance information, he wrote, came from the column cover. Read that line again. The best air reconnaissance information came from the column cover. The tanks were being told what was ahead of them by the planes orbiting above. The planes were being told where to look by the controllers in the tanks. The system was a feedback loop, and the loop ran in minutes, not hours, When German units tried to rally and counterattack, they walked into the loop. Major Helmut Ritgen, watching this happen to his own panzer regiment, described it as Russian roulette. Wait for the dive. Run while they are climbing. Hide before they finish the turn. By the time you get to the next piece of cover, there is another flight already inbound. The 50th Fighter Bomber Group's daily action report from the breakout period gives a sense of the rhythm. On July 29th, 3 squadrons of P-47s, in a single day, flew 23 missions. They reported destroying 46 tanks, more than 80 other vehicles, 8 horse-drawn guns, multiple buildings, and an estimated 50 German troops. They lost 3 aircraft to flak. That was 1 fighter group, on 1 day, in 1 sector. Multiply that across the whole front. The German army in Normandy was not being defeated by superior tanks. It was being unmade, road by an enemy that knew where it was at all times. Bayerlane, in despair, sent a report to his superiors. The text has survived. He wrote that after 49 days of fierce combat, the Panzer Lehr Division was finally annihilated. The enemy, he wrote, was now rolling through all sectors. All calls for help, he reported, had gone unanswered, because no one believed how serious the situation was. The phrase that mattered, the phrase the post-war German staff officers kept coming back to, was no one believed how serious the situation was. The German command structure could not absorb what had happened. Panzer Lehr was an elite division. It had been disassembled in a matter of days, not by tanks, not by infantry, but by what the Germans were now calling, with growing fear, the Jabos. The German word Jabo was short for Jagdbomber, fighter bomber. By the summer of 1944, the word had taken on a meaning beyond its dictionary definition. According to the historian Robert Citino, writing for the National World War II Museum, German troops invented a new compound word for what was happening to them, Jabotod, death by Jabo. By the end of June 1944, multiple German generals were dead from Jabo attacks. General Erich Marx, commanding 84th Corps, killed by air attack on June 12th. General Heinz Hellmich of the 243rd Division, killed on June 17th, struck by 20mm cannon fire from a strafing fighter. General Rudolf Stegmann of the 77th Division, killed on June 18th. Citino listed 5 German generals killed in just the first 2 weeks of the Normandy fighting, and 3 of them were killed by Allied fighter bombers. 5 generals in 2 weeks. That is a casualty rate among general officers that no army can sustain for long. But here is what those German prisoners in their interrogations still could not figure out. They knew the Jabos were everywhere. They could not understand the speed, the minutes. They knew the Americans had air superiority. They knew the Americans had radios. What they could not believe, what their own training told them was impossible, was that an ordinary American sergeant could be talking directly to a flight of fighter bombers in real time. The Wehrmacht system did not allow it. The Luftwaffe system did not allow it. Every doctrine they had ever learned said it could not be done. The fact that it was being done meant that the Americans had figured out something. And the next 2 months, during the battles around Mortain and the long retreat across France, would show the Germans in detail exactly what the something was, and it would not save them. Part 4. On August 7th, 1944, before dawn, Adolf Hitler launched the German army's last serious counterattack in the West. The plan was called Operation Lüttich. The American breakout had created a narrow corridor near of ranches, where Patton's Third Army was pouring through into open country. If the Germans could cut the corridor at Mortain, 20 miles inland, they could split the American army, isolate Patton in Brittany, and possibly force a negotiated peace. For the attack, the German command assembled what was left of its armored reserves, 4 panzer divisions, approximately 300 tanks, the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, the 1st SS Panzer Division, the 116th Panzer, the 2nd Panzer, veterans of the Eastern Front. To preserve surprise, there would be no preparatory artillery bombardment. The attack would go in at night, in fog, hopefully before American air power could engage. The night part worked. The fog part worked briefly. By 4 a.m. on August 7th, the lead German elements had hit the American 30th Infantry Division at Mortain and overrun several positions. They captured the town itself. The 2nd Battalion of the 120th Infantry Regiment was cut off on a hill called Hill 314, surrounded, isolated, and short on everything except courage. Then the fog burned off. This is where the American air-ground system did something the German planners had genuinely not anticipated. The German commanders knew there would be Allied air attacks. They had factored that in. What they had not factored in was the speed. The way the planes would arrive within minutes of any radio call. The way the planes would not just attack the first wave, but would orbit, find every column behind it. By noon on August 7th, the morning fog had dispersed and large numbers of Allied aircraft appeared over the battlefield. The Luftwaffe, which Hitler had personally promised would commit 1,000 fighters to support the attack, was simply not there. Their fighters, when they tried to take off, were engaged the moment they got into the air by American fighters operating well beyond the battlefield. The Luftwaffe pilots reported in their own records that they could not even reach the front, let alone fly support over it. On the American side, Quesada's 9th Tactical Air Command and Otto Wayland's 19th Tactical Air Command had been reinforced with British 2nd Tactical Air Force squadrons. The British contributed Hawker Typhoons armed with rockets. The Americans contributed wave after wave of P-47 Thunderbolts. And on Hill 314, surrounded by SS Panzer troops, 2 American forward observers became a turning point in the entire battle. Their names were 1st Lieutenant Charles A. Bartz and 2nd Lieutenant Robert L. Weiss. Both were forward observers attached to the 231st Field Artillery Battalion. From the summit of Hill 314, with binoculars and radios, they could see every road around Mortain and every German movement on those roads. Weiss has left a detailed record of what happened on that hill. He wrote a book about it after the war called Fire Mission that became one of the foundational accounts of close fire support in the European theater. According to his account, and according to the National World War II Museum's history of the battle, Bartz and Weiss directed devastating American artillery salvos against the 2nd SS Panzer Division and the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division, degrading German assaults on Hill 314 and compromising the German effort to drive on Avranches. By the end of the first day, the 19th Tactical Air Command had flown approximately 400 sorties over the Mortain battle area. Total claims included 12 to 13 panzers destroyed, 98 trucks, and 90 horse-drawn vehicles. 7 rocket-armed P-47s of the U.S. 406th Fighter Group accounted for all of the panzer kills on that single day. 7 planes, 12 tanks, about 600 rockets fired. Historians have long argued about how many German tanks American air power destroyed at Mortain. The point that nobody disputes is what the air power did to the operational tempo of the German attack. As the historian Ed Lengel has documented for the National World War II Museum, German tank crews simply stopped advancing. They abandoned their vehicles when they thought the planes were close. The safest place during a Jabo attack, they had learned, was outside the tank because the planes targeted the vehicles. And while they were standing in the ditches watching their tanks get shredded, the American infantry on Hill 314 kept calling artillery onto their positions, and the American tanks of the 3rd Armored Division kept advancing. By August 9th, just 2 days into the operation, Lüttich was effectively dead. The 30th Infantry Division had held. Patton had not been cut off. The Falaise pocket was beginning to close around what was left of the German 7th Army. A German general named Hasso von Manteuffel, who would later command the 5th Panzer Army at the Bulge, wrote a post-war memoir trying to explain what had happened to the Wehrmacht in the West. With the bitterness of a professional soldier examining his own defeat, he wrote that Allied air forces found worthwhile targets throughout the entire area of the German offensive. The German supply system was throttled. The mobility of German forces, in his exact words, decreased steadily and rapidly. Steadily and rapidly. That captures it. Not collapse all at once. A steady, unstoppable, rapid decrease in mobility driven by an enemy that could see every road and every assembly area at all times. But here is the question that has driven this analysis from the beginning. The question the German commanders kept asking each other in their interrogations and their post-war memoirs: how did the Americans build the system in the first place? Because the radio in the tank was easy. Anybody could put a radio in a tank. The doctrine, the trust, the integration, the sheer institutional willingness to let an infantry sergeant tell a fighter pilot what to do, that was the hard part, and every other major army had failed to solve it. If your father or grandfather flew with the 9th Air Force, the 12th Tactical Air Command, or any of the fighter groups that supported the breakout, I would be honored to read their unit and their stories in the comments below. The names that mattered are not just the famous ones. They are the squadron leaders, the radio men in the tanks, the L-5 pilots who flew unarmed 3,000 feet over Wehrmacht panzer divisions. Their families know things that did not make it into the books. Please share what you know. Part 5. By the fall of 1944, the German army was retreating across France, then across Belgium, then back to the western border of Germany. In December, in the snow and fog of the Ardennes forest, Hitler tried one last time. He launched the Battle of the Bulge. He chose his moment with care. He chose it specifically because of the weather. The German planners needed days of bad weather, days of fog and overcast that would ground the Allied air forces. Their entire offensive plan, the timetable, the fuel calculations, everything, depended on neutralizing American air power for at least a week. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, who commanded the offensive, said directly in his post-war testimony that the main reason for the failure of the Ardennes offensive was his own lack of fighters and reconnaissance planes, and what he called the tremendous tactical air power of the Allies. The first week of the Bulge unfolded almost exactly as the German planners had hoped. Heavy fog, low ceilings, the Allied tactical air forces grounded. German tanks rolled west toward Bastogne, toward the Meuse, toward Antwerp. American units took heavy casualties, but the weather could not last, and on December 23, 1944, an eastern high-pressure system, called by the meteorologists the Russian High, pushed into the area and cleared the skies. The records of what happened on December 23rd and the days that followed are extraordinary. According to the National World War II Museum's History of the Campaign, fighter bombers immediately began destroying hundreds of German vehicles. The German 2nd Panzer Division, which had pushed nearly to the Meuse, was caught in the open by P-47s and stopped cold short of the river. Inside Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne and Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division were surrounded. Colonel William L. Roberts, commanding the 10th Armored Division's Combat Command, told his superiors that the American fighter bombers were worth, in his words, 2 or 3 infantry divisions. 2 or 3 infantry divisions. From a man who'd been holding a perimeter against constant attack with a force of paratroopers and tankers. He was not exaggerating. The 406th Fighter Group on that day claimed 97 vehicles, 11 tanks, 20 horse-drawn vehicles, and 24 gun positions destroyed. Those numbers were probably exaggerated. Combat claims usually are, but the German postponements that followed the strikes were real. The Germans postponed their attacks until night. They knew that as long as the sun was up, the planes were up. By Christmas Day, the German offensive in the Bastogne sector was effectively broken. The relief column from Patton's Third Army made contact on December 26th. So let us return now to the puzzle that opened this story, to the German tank commander who could not understand who he was fighting. Why was American infantry able to call airstrikes in minutes when the Germans, with what they had always considered a superior air force, needed hours to put planes over a target? The answer, now that we have walked through the system piece by piece, comes into focus. It was not one innovation. It was a stack of innovations that together produced something none of the individual pieces could explain. The first piece was Quesada himself, an Air Force officer who refused to believe that his pilots were too important to take orders from infantry sergeants. He put fighter bomber pilots in the gunner's seat of a Sherman tank. He gave them VHF radios that could talk to the planes overhead. He killed the bureaucratic chain that German officers had to climb every time they wanted air support. The second piece was the cab rank. 4 planes, continuously from dawn to dusk, orbiting over the lead column. Not on call, not waiting for a request. There, always there. The German tank commander who needed 5 minutes to call for support could not be helped because his support was an hour or two away. The American tank commander already had support 2,000 feet directly above him. The third piece was the Horsefly, slow, vulnerable little airplanes flown by volunteer fighter-bomber pilots at 3,000 feet behind the front line, looking down at 20 miles of German rear area. The eyes the Germans could not find because they had stopped paying attention to small, unarmed observation planes years before. The fourth piece was a culture. American infantry sergeants and forward observers were trusted to talk directly to pilots. The Wehrmacht did not work that way. The Luftwaffe did not work that way. No major army had worked that way before. In the American system, when an infantry company commander said there were tanks in those woods, the pilots believed him and attacked. In the German system, the same report would go up the chain, be logged, be forwarded, be prioritized, and eventually, hours or days later, become a tasking order that arrived after the tanks had moved. The German prisoners had no category for any of this. They had been trained in a system in which professional separation between branches was a sign of seriousness. The American system, in which a sergeant could pick up a radio handset and direct an airstrike, looked to a German professional almost amateurish. It violated every principle of how a serious army was supposed to function, and yet it worked. It worked so well that by the spring of 1945, German divisions could not move on roads in daylight, could not assemble for counterattacks, could not even maintain stable supply lines. That is what defeat looks like in a system war, not a single decisive battle, not a glorious last stand, a precise calculation by the losing side of when their personnel simply runs out because the enemy has built a machine that destroys it faster than they can replace it. The forensic verdict on the Western Front campaign is this: the German army was not destroyed by American tanks. The Sherman was, by every objective measure of armor and gunnery, inferior to the Panther and the Tiger. The German army was not destroyed by American infantry. American infantry, division for division, was no better than German infantry, and was often less experienced. The German army was destroyed by an air-ground system that turned every American infantry company into a forward air controller, every American forward observer into the eyes of a fighter wing, every American armored column into a spear tip with continuous overhead protection. That system was not built by Eisenhower. It was not built by Patton. It was not built by Bradley. It was built principally by a stubborn outsider named Pete Quesada and the volunteer pilots and ordinary infantry sergeants and tank commanders who agreed to trust each other. The tank commanders trusted that the pilots would not bomb their own. The pilots trusted that the tank commanders would tell them the truth about what was in the trees. That trust, once it existed, multiplied American firepower by an order of magnitude that the Germans could not match because they could not build the same trust between branches. The Germans never built it. They had time. They had the engineering. They had the radios. What they did not have was the institutional willingness to let a sergeant talk to a major, and that, in the end, was what cost them the war in the West. If this forensic audit gave you something new, hit the like button. It helps this channel reach the viewers who care about the version of history built from the documents and the interrogations, not just the version that made it into the textbooks. Subscribe if you want the next chapter. Because the men who flew the Horseflies, the men who sat in those Shermans with VHF sets where the bow gunner used to be, the forward observers on Hill 314 with binoculars and a radio, they have not been remembered the way they should be. The system they built ended a war. Their names should be common knowledge. They are not. The least we can do is keep telling the story until they are. War is mathematics. But the men who built the equation had names. Quesada, Bartz, Weiss, Ritgen, who watched it from the other side and lived to write down what he saw. They deserve to be remembered. By name, by the units they served in. The Germans understood in 1944 that they were facing something new. We owe it to history to understand.